A gunshot echoed across the plains as Rebecca Elliot stood alone at the altar, her white wedding dress billowing in the warm June breeze of 1875, tears streaming down her face while the congregation whispered behind her. She could still see the dust cloud trailing behind Samuel Harrison's horse as he fled Red Creek, Colorado, leaving her to face the humiliation of being abandoned on what should have been the happiest day of her life. Rebecca clutched her bouquet of wildflowers so tightly her knuckles turned white, the lace gloves her mother had sewn doing little to hide her trembling hands. The church fell silent when a tall figure appeared in the doorway, his silhouette backlit by the blinding afternoon sun. Only when he stepped forward did she recognize Colton Irvine, the quiet cowboy who worked her father's ranch, the man who had been Samuel's best friend. "Samuel ain't coming back, Miss Rebecca," Colton said, his deep voice carrying throughout the small church as he removed his hat and walked slowly down the aisle. His dark hair was slicked back, and his usually dusty clothes had been replaced with a clean black suit that looked uncomfortable on his broad shoulders. But these good folks came to see a wedding. He stopped before her, his blue eyes meeting hers as he took her trembling hands in his calloused ones. "If you'll allow me," he said, his voice lowered so only she could hear, "then I'll finish these vows myself." The church remained deathly quiet as Rebecca stared up at the man who'd always been in the background, always watching, always kind, but never forward. A man she had barely noticed while being swept off her feet by Samuel's grand promises and flashy smile. "Why would you do this?" She whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "Because no one deserves to be left standing alone," he replied simply. "And because I've been waiting for you to see me since the day you turned 16. Rebecca felt her heart pounding as the church waited for her answer. Every instinct told her to run, to hide her shame, to lock herself away. But something in Colton's steady gaze held her in place. This wasn't pity in his eyes, it was something else entirely. "I don't love you," she whispered, feeling cruel but needing to speak the truth. "I know that," he replied, a small smile touching his lips. "But maybe someday you might." He squeezed her hands gently. "Besides, your pa needs help with the ranch, and you need a husband to keep the bank from taking your land. We don't have to be more than partners if that's what you want." Rebecca glanced at her father, sitting in the front pew with his head bowed, shoulders slumped in defeat. After her mother's death last winter, the ranch had fallen into debt. Samuel had promised to save them all, but now— "You'll stay?" she asked Colton, suddenly afraid he might change his mind. "Until my dying day," he promised, and there was such conviction in his voice that Rebecca found herself nodding, even as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. The Reverend, who had been watching this exchange with a mixture of confusion and concern, cleared his throat. "Shall we proceed?" "Yes," Rebecca said, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "Yes, we shall." And so Rebecca Elliot married Colton Irvine under the watchful eyes of the entire town of Red Creek, with the man she'd been prepared to marry galloping as far from her as his horse could carry him. The wedding reception at the Elliot Ranch was a subdued affair. Most guests stayed only long enough to be polite, clearly uncomfortable with the dramatic turn of events. Rebecca sat at the head table beside her new husband, barely touching the food on her plate, aware of the pitying glances cast her way. "You should eat something," Colton said quietly, pushing a plate of roast beef toward her. "I'm not hungry," she replied, twisting the simple gold band on her finger, a ring that had belonged to Colton's mother, not the elaborate one Samuel had promised to buy her once they reached Denver. "You'll need your strength." Colton's voice remained gentle, but there was a firmness to it that made Rebecca look up at him. "Tomorrow won't be easy. None of this is easy," she snapped, then immediately regretted her tone. "I'm sorry, don't be." Colton took a sip of his whiskey, the only indulgence he'd allowed himself all day. "You have every right to be angry. Just don't take it out on yourself by starving." Rebecca picked up her fork and took a small bite to appease him, surprised when her stomach immediately demanded more. She hadn't eaten since breakfast, too nervous about the wedding to manage more than a few bites of toast. "Why did you do this, truly?" she asked after several minutes of silence. "It can't just be because you feel sorry for me." Colton set down his glass, his eyes surveying the thinning crowd before returning to her face. "I've worked for your father for 5 years, Rebecca. I've watched you grow from a girl into a woman. I've seen how you run this ranch when your father can't, how you comfort the hands when they're hurt, how you stay up all night with a sick calf." He paused, a slight flush creeping up his neck. "And maybe I've wanted to court you for a long time but never felt worthy enough to try." Rebecca studied him with new interest. Colton had always been a fixture at the ranch, reliable and steady, but so quiet she'd barely noticed him beyond giving orders or passing along her father's instructions. He was handsome in a rugged way, with sun-weathered skin and laugh lines around his eyes, though she'd rarely seen him laugh. "Samuel was your friend," she said, the betrayal still fresh. "Samuel was a gambling man who saw your father's land as a way to pay off his debts," Colton replied bluntly. "I tried to warn you, but you wouldn't hear it." Rebecca felt her cheeks burning with humiliation. "Is that common knowledge?" "No, just something I overheard in the saloon." Colton's hand moved toward hers on the table but stopped short of touching it. "I never told anyone." "So you married me to save me from my own foolishness?" "I married you because I believe we could build something good together." His eyes met hers, unflinching and honest. "But if you want an annulment once the gossip dies down, I won't fight you on it." Rebecca absorbed this, feeling oddly comforted by his offer of freedom even as she had just bound herself to him. Before she could respond, her father approached, walking with the cane he'd needed since a horse had thrown him last fall. "Time for you two to head home," Thomas Elliot said, his voice gruff with emotion. "I've had the hands prepare the old Morton cabin for you. It's not much, but it's on a good piece of land." The Morton cabin sat on the far eastern edge of Elliot property, a solid 2 miles from the main house. Rebecca had visited it only a handful of times over the years, bringing supplies to the elderly couple who had lived there until Mr. Morton's passing last year. Mrs. Morton had moved to live with her daughter in Denver shortly after. "The cabin," Rebecca looked at her father in surprise. "But I thought a married woman needs her own home," her father interrupted. "Colton's been fixing it up these past few weeks, thought he was just being helpful." Thomas gave Colton a hard look. "Guess he had other plans all along." Colton stood, meeting Thomas's gaze steadily. "I fixed it up because it was falling apart and Mrs. Morton deserved better. I never planned this." Thomas assessed him for a long moment before nodding once. "Well, it's yours now, both of yours." He reached out and squeezed Rebecca's shoulder. "I'm sorry about Samuel, darling, but maybe this is God's way of protecting you from a worse fate." Rebecca couldn't bring herself to agree, but she nodded and allowed her father to help her up from the table. The few remaining guests offered awkward congratulations as Colton led her outside to where a wagon waited, already loaded with her trunks. The journey to the cabin was silent except for the creak of wagon wheels and the occasional snort from the horses. Rebecca watched the familiar landscape of the ranch passing by, trying to reconcile herself to how dramatically her life had changed in a single day. This morning, she had been eagerly dressing for her wedding, dreaming of the fine house Samuel would build her in town. Now she was heading to a remote cabin with a man she barely knew. When they arrived, Rebecca was surprised to see smoke curling from the chimney. "Who's there?" she asked, suddenly anxious. "I asked Mrs. Perkins to come by and get things ready," Colton explained, referring to the ranch cook. "She should be gone by now." The cabin was indeed empty when they entered, but a fire burned cheerfully in the stone hearth, and the simple wooden furniture gleamed with fresh polish. New curtains hung at the windows, and a colorful quilt covered the bed in the corner, her mother's wedding quilt, Rebecca realized with a pang. "It's not what you expected for your wedding night," Colton said, bringing in her trunks. "But it's clean and solid." Rebecca walked slowly around the main room, noting the care that had gone into the preparations. Fresh flowers sat in a mason jar on the table, and the pantry shelves were stocked with preserves and dry goods. "Where will you sleep?" she asked, suddenly aware of the single bed. Colton pointed to a narrow cot near the fire. "There until you decide otherwise." Rebecca nodded, grateful for his understanding. "Thank you. I'll give you some privacy to change," he said, heading back outside to tend to the horses. Alone, Rebecca unpacked her nightgown, then hesitated, looking at the wedding dress she still wore. It had been her mother's, altered to fit her smaller frame, and now it would forever be associated with humiliation rather than joy. When Colton returned, she was sitting at the table in her robe, her hair loose around her shoulders, the wedding dress carefully packed away. He had removed his suit jacket and tie but otherwise remained fully dressed. "I made some tea," she said, gesturing to the pot on the table. "Thank you." He sat across from her, keeping his distance. "I know this isn't what you wanted, Rebecca. I won't pretend otherwise, but I promise to be a good husband to you in whatever way you need." Rebecca poured the tea, watching the steam rise between them. "I don't know what I need anymore," she admitted. "Everything I thought I knew turned out to be wrong." "Not everything," Colton said quietly. "You know this land. You know your own strength. Samuel may have left you, but he didn't take those things with him." Rebecca looked up, surprised by his insight. "No, he didn't," she agreed, feeling something shift within her, not healing exactly, but perhaps the beginning of acceptance. "And I suppose I have gained a husband who at least knows how to shoe a horse properly." The corner of Colton's mouth twitched. "That I do." "Then perhaps we should talk about tomorrow," Rebecca said, straightening her shoulders. "If we're to be partners in this, I want to understand your plans for our section of the ranch." As they talked into the night, Rebecca began to see Colton Irvine in a new light, not as her rescuer or a replacement for Samuel, but as a man with his own ideas and dreams, a man who saw her as an equal rather than a prize. By the time they retired to their separate beds, Rebecca felt the first fragile thread of hope that perhaps this unexpected marriage might become something she hadn't dared imagine, a true partnership. The first light of dawn filtered through the curtains as Rebecca stirred beneath her mother's wedding quilt. For a blissful moment, she forgot the previous day's events, lost in the familiar comfort of half-sleep. Then reality crashed over her like a bucket of cold water. She was married to Colton Irvine, not Samuel Harrison. She opened her eyes to find the cabin empty, the cot by the fire neatly made. The smell of coffee permeated the air, and a plate of biscuits sat covered on the table with a note beside it. "Gone to check fence lines, back by noon." Rebecca dressed quickly in a simple work dress, grateful for Colton's absence as she adjusted to her new surroundings. The cabin was smaller than her room at the main house, but Colton had made the most of the space. A bookshelf held a surprisingly varied collection of volumes, from practical guides on animal husbandry to well-worn novels. A desk in the corner held neat stacks of papers, ledgers, and maps, she discovered upon closer inspection. After breakfast, Rebecca stepped outside to survey what was now her home. The cabin sat on a gentle rise overlooking a creek, with mountains visible in the distance. A small barn stood nearby, and beyond that, the beginnings of what looked like a garden, freshly turned earth marked with neat rows. The sound of hooves drew her attention to the path leading from the main ranch. To her dismay, it was her cousin Martha riding toward her, no doubt bursting with curiosity about the dramatic events of the wedding. "Rebecca, Elliot, or should I say Irvine now?" Martha called as she dismounted, her round face flushed with excitement. "The whole town is talking about nothing else." "I'm sure they are," Rebecca replied stiffly, bracing herself for the onslaught of questions. Martha bustled forward, gripping Rebecca's arms as she studied her face. "Are you all right? I couldn't believe it when Samuel just rode off like that." And then for Colton to step in, why, it was the most romantic thing I've ever witnessed. Romantic. Rebecca pulled away, incredulous. "It was humiliating." "Oh, of course it was terrible what Samuel did," Martha backpedaled quickly. "But the way Colton declared himself in front of everyone, he didn't declare anything," Rebecca corrected, moving toward the garden to escape her cousin's prying eyes. "He offered a practical solution to a difficult situation." Martha followed, undeterred. "That's not how people are telling it. They're saying he's been in love with you for years, waiting for his chance." Rebecca felt her cheeks warming despite herself. "People should mind their own business." "So it's not true," Martha pressed, eyes gleaming with curiosity. "He doesn't love you." Rebecca busied herself examining the garden rows, noting that Colton had already planted onions and potatoes. "I don't know his feelings, Martha. We barely spoke before yesterday." Well, what was your wedding night like then? Martha lowered her voice conspirationally. Is he gentle? Samuel always seemed so rough around the edges, but Colton, Martha, Rebecca straightened, her patience snapping. That is quite enough. My marriage is not a topic for your entertainment. Martha had the grace to look abashed. I'm sorry, truly, I'm just worried about you, we all are. It's not every day a bride ends up with the best man instead of the groom. Rebecca softened slightly at the genuine concern beneath her cousin's gossip. I appreciate the worry, but I'm managing. Colton has been kind. Martha raised an eyebrow. Is that all? That's enough for now, Rebecca replied firmly. Now, was there a purpose to your visit beyond satisfying your curiosity? Martha sighed dramatically but reached into her saddlebag. Your father sent these over. Some papers he said Colton would understand. She handed Rebecca a sealed envelope. And I brought pie. Figured your first day as a married woman shouldn't be without something sweet. Despite her irritation, Rebecca was touched by the gesture. Thank you, Martha. Would you like to come in for coffee? Over coffee and apple pie, Martha filled Rebecca in on the aftermath of the wedding, including the sheriff's discovery that Samuel had cleared out his room at the boarding house days before the ceremony, clearly planning his escape well in advance. They found gambling markers in his things, Martha said between bites of pie. Seems he owed money to some dangerous men in Denver. Rebecca absorbed this information, feeling both vindicated and foolish. Colton had been right about Samuel all along, and how is my father taking all this? She asked, concerned for the man who had barely recovered from her mother's death. Martha's expression grew serious. He's putting on a brave face, but Mrs. Perkins says he was up all night with his whiskey, blames himself for not seeing through Samuel. It wasn't his fault, Rebecca said quickly. Samuel fooled us all. Not all, Martha pointed out. Your new husband seemed to have his number. After Martha left, Rebecca found herself restless, unable to settle into any task for long. The cabin felt simultaneously too small and too empty, reminding her with every glance that her life had taken an unexpected turn. Finally, she decided to explore the land that was now hers, theirs, grabbing a shawl and heading toward the creek. The spring runoff had the water running high and fast, but a flat rock near the bank provided a perfect perch for contemplation. Rebecca sat watching the water rush by, trying to sort through the tangle of emotions inside her betrayal and humiliation over Samuel's abandonment, confusion and uncertainty about her marriage to Colton, and beneath it all, a strange relief that she hadn't discovered Samuel's true character after it was too late to escape. The sound of a horse approaching broke her reverie. Colton rode into view, his tall frame easy in the saddle, hat pulled low against the midday sun. He spotted her by the creek and changed direction, dismounting a respectful distance away, enjoying the view. He asked, approaching slowly as if afraid she might flee, "It's beautiful here," she admitted. "I'd forgotten how peaceful this corner of the ranch could be. That's why I always liked working this section." Colton remained standing, squinting at the horizon. Far enough away that a man can hear himself think. Rebecca studied him openly for perhaps the first time. Colton Irvine was 30 years old, she knew that much from ranch conversations. He'd arrived in Red Creek 5 years ago with little more than his horse and saddle, proving himself an excellent horseman and a diligent worker. His face was weathered from years outdoors, but his blue eyes remained clear and direct. He wasn't conventionally handsome like Samuel, whose smooth talking and city manners had turned heads throughout town, but there was something compelling about Colton's quiet strength. "Martha brought papers from my father," she said, breaking the silence. "And gossip, of course." Colton's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "I can imagine. People think you've been secretly in love with me for years," Rebecca said bluntly, watching for his reaction. To her surprise, a flush crept up from his collar and he removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair before replacing it. "People talk too much. Is it true?" she pressed, needing to understand exactly what she had gotten herself into. Colton sighed, finally sitting down on the rock beside her, though he maintained a careful distance. "I've admired you for a long time, Rebecca. You're strong and kind, and you love this land almost as much as I do." He stared at the rushing water. but I never let myself think beyond that. You were the boss's daughter, educated and refined. I'm just a cowboy with dirt under his fingernails. And yet you married me. I did. He turned to face her, his expression serious. Because I couldn't stand seeing you hurt, and because I believe we can build something good together. But I don't expect you to love me back, not now, maybe not ever. What if I never do? Rebecca asked, voicing her greatest fear. What kind of marriage would that be? A respectful one, Colton answered simply. I promised to be a good husband, and I meant it. That includes honoring your feelings, whatever they may be. Rebecca felt something tighten in her chest, not love, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of trust. I'm not sure I know how to be a good wife. I reckon we'll figure it out together. Colton stood, offering his hand to help her up. For now, maybe we can start by seeing about those fence lines. I could use your eye for the north pasture planning. Rebecca took his hand, allowing him to pull her to her feet. His palm was calloused but warm, his grip solid without being confining. I'd like that, she said, realizing she meant it. As they rode together across the rolling grassland, Rebecca found herself studying Colton's profile against the blue Colorado sky, wondering if perhaps fate had been kinder to her than she first thought. The summer days stretched long and golden as Rebecca and Colton settled into an unexpected rhythm of married life. They worked side by side from dawn until dusk, mending fences, tending livestock, and preparing for the fall roundup. At night, they shared meals at their small table, talking about the day's work or reading aloud from Colton's collection of books. He continued to sleep on the cot by the fire, never pressuring her for more than she was ready to give. Word reached them that Samuel had been spotted in Denver, already courting a banker's daughter with promises of his successful cattle ranch in Colorado. The news stung Rebecca less than she expected, reinforcing her growing certainty that she had escaped a terrible mistake. By July, their garden was flourishing under Rebecca's careful tending, and Colton had built an addition to the cabin, a proper bedroom that would give them both more privacy. The project had kept him busy during every spare moment, his hands skilled with tools in a way that continually surprised her. It's beautiful, Rebecca said, running her hand along the smooth pine doorframe he had just installed. Where did you learn to build like this? Colton wiped sweat from his brow, pleased by her approval. My father was a carpenter before he took up ranching. Taught me everything he knew before the fever took him. It was rare for Colton to mention his past, and Rebecca seized the opportunity to learn more about the man who was her husband in name but still largely a mystery. You never speak of your family. Not much to tell. Colton began gathering his tools, a signal he was uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. They're gone now, have been for a long while. I'd still like to know, Rebecca persisted gently. If we're to be partners in this life, shouldn't I know where you came from? Colton paused, considering her words. Finally, he nodded toward the creek. Let's walk a spell. It's a long story, and I could use the air. As they walked along the creek bank in the golden evening light, Colton revealed pieces of himself that had been hidden beneath his quiet exterior. He had grown up in Missouri, the son of a carpenter turned farmer. His mother had died when he was 12, leaving him and his father to manage alone. They had been doing well enough until the war came, tearing their community apart and eventually taking his father's life. He wasn't a soldier, Colton explained, his voice tight. Just a man who believed in feeding hungry people, regardless of which side they fought for. Some didn't take kindly to that philosophy. After his father's death, 16-year-old Colton had drifted west, working as a ranch hand, a trail cook, even a silver miner for a brief, miserable stint. He'd fought Indians in his early 20s, an experience that had left him with both respect for his adversaries and a deep weariness of violence. I came to Red Creek looking for quiet, he concluded as they circled back toward the cabin. Found it here on your father's land. Never expected to find more than that. Rebecca absorbed his story, seeing how it had shaped the steadfast, self-contained man beside her. Thank you for telling me. Colton nodded, seemingly relieved to have shared his past. Your turn now, he said with a small smile. I know you grew up here, but there must be more to Rebecca Elliot than meets the eye. Irvine, she corrected automatically, surprising both of them. It was the first time she had claimed his name as her own. Colton's smile deepened, reaching his eyes in a way that made something flutter in Rebecca's chest. "Rebecca Irvine," he repeated softly. "I like the sound of that." As the sun set behind the mountains, Rebecca shared her own story, her childhood on the ranch, her mother's insistence that she receive a proper education despite their remote location, her dreams of someday seeing the ocean. She spoke of losing her mother to pneumonia the previous winter and watching her father retreat into grief. "Samuel seemed like salvation," she admitted, shame coloring her words. "He talked about taking me to San Francisco, about building a life beyond this ranch. I think I was running from the pain as much as chasing a dream." "There's no shame in wanting to escape grief," Colton said, his hand brushing against hers as they walked. "But I'm selfishly glad you're still here." Rebecca looked up at him, struck by the honesty in his expression. For the first time since their hasty marriage, she allowed herself to truly consider Colton as more than a convenient solution to her abandonment. In the fading light, with his guard down and his story shared, she saw not just the capable ranch hand or the unexpected husband, but a man of depth and principle. "I'm beginning to be glad too," she admitted quietly. Something shifted between them that evening. A door opened that neither had been willing to approach before. As they returned to the cabin, Colton's hand found hers, and Rebecca did not pull away. August brought scorching heat and drought to Colorado, testing both the land and its caretakers. The creek dwindled to a trickle, and the grass in the pastures turned brown and brittle. Cattle grew thin despite Colton's careful management, and tension mounted throughout the region as ranchers watched their livelihoods wither under the relentless sun. Rebecca woke one morning to find Colton already gone, his cot empty and cold. A note on the table informed her he had ridden to the north boundary to check on a spring that might still hold water. She tried to ignore the prickle of worry as she went about her morning chores, telling herself that Colton knew this land better than anyone. By midday, with the sun beating down mercilessly and no sign of his return, her concern deepened. When one of the ranch hands rode up with news of a brush fire near the northern property line, fear replaced worry entirely. "Your husband's up there fighting it with some of the boys," the hand reported, already turning his horse to return. "Mr. Elliot sent me to fetch you to the main house until it's under control." "I'm going to help," Rebecca declared, already moving toward the barn to saddle her mare. The hand looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Irvine said specifically to keep you away from the fire, madam. Did he now?" Rebecca's eyes flashed as she continued toward the barn. "Well, Mr. Irvine doesn't give me orders. This is our land and I'll defend it alongside him." Despite the hand's protests, Rebecca was soon galloping north, a bandana soaked in water tied around her nose and mouth against the smoke that grew thicker as she approached. The acrid smell filled her lungs, and ash drifted through the air like perverse snowflakes. She found chaos at the fire line, men with wet blankets beating at flames, others digging trenches to create fire breaks, horses whinnying in fear as the blaze crackled and leaped. Through the smoke and confusion, she spotted Colton, his face blackened with soot, directing men with calm authority despite the danger surrounding them. When he saw her, his expression shifted from concentration to alarm. "Rebecca," he shouted, striding toward her, "get back to the cabin." "I came to help," she replied, dismounting and tying her nervous mare to a distant tree. "Tell me what to do." For a moment, she thought he might bodily carry her away from danger, but the fire was spreading too quickly to waste time arguing. "Take that shovel," he directed tersely. "Help widen the trench on the eastern edge. Stay within sight." For hours, Rebecca worked alongside the men, her arms aching and lungs burning as they fought to contain the fire. The heat was unbearable, the smoke disorienting, but she refused to retreat. Twice Colton appeared at her side with water, his face rigid with concern each time. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever known," he told her during one such moment, his voice rough from smoke. "You married me," she reminded him, gulping the water gratefully. Something that might have been a smile flickered across his exhausted face. "So I did." By nightfall, they had the fire contained, though small pockets continued to smolder across the blackened landscape. The damage was extensive, but could have been far worse. They'd saved the main grazing land and most of the northern timber. Too exhausted to make the ride home, they collapsed at the main ranch house, where Mrs. Perkins fussed over their smoke-stained clothes and minor burns. Rebecca's father embraced her tightly, his relief palpable. "You could have been killed," he admonished, looking between her and Colton. "Both of you." "We weren't," Rebecca said simply, accepting a cup of strong coffee from Mrs. Perkins. Later, as they prepared to sleep in her old bedroom, Colton insisting he would take the floor despite her father's raised eyebrows, Rebecca watched her husband carefully clean a burn on his forearm. "Let me," she said, taking the cloth from his hands and gently bathing the wound. The intimacy of the moment wasn't lost on either of them. This was the closest they had been since their wedding day. "You shouldn't have come to the fire," Colton said quietly, watching her ministrations, "but I'm proud of how you handled yourself." Rebecca looked up, meeting his gaze. "We're partners, remember? That means in danger as well as in daily work." Colton reached up with his good hand, brushing a strand of soot-streaked hair from her face. The touch was gentle, almost reverent. "I've never met anyone like you, Rebecca Irvine." The way he said her married name sent warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the day's fire. Without thinking, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a brief, tender kiss that surprised them both. When she pulled back, Colton's eyes were wide with wonder. "What was that for?" he whispered. "For being a man worth kissing," she replied simply. That night, for the first time since their marriage, Colton did not sleep apart from her. Though they did nothing more than hold each other, both too exhausted for greater intimacy, something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. As Rebecca drifted to sleep with her head on Colton's chest, listening to his steady heartbeat, she realized that what had begun as a marriage of convenience was becoming something far more precious. The fire marked a turning point in more ways than one. The drought broke the following week with 3 days of steady rain that transformed the parched landscape. New grass began to sprout from the blackened earth, and the creek flowed strong again. Similarly, the careful distance Rebecca and Colton had maintained began to dissolve, replaced by a growing closeness neither had anticipated. With the newly completed bedroom providing privacy, they discovered each other as true husband and wife, learning the language of touch and tenderness that neither had expected to share. Rebecca was surprised by Colton's gentleness, the careful way he sought her pleasure before his own, the reverence with which he spoke her name in their most intimate moments. September brought cooler weather and the fall roundup, a time of intense work that left little opportunity for private moments. Rebecca rode alongside Colton and the other ranch hands, her skill with horses earning respect even from the most skeptical cowboys. At night, they collapsed into bed too tired for anything but sleep, yet Colton never failed to pull her close, as if reassuring himself she was truly there. It was during the roundup that Samuel Harrison made his unwelcome return to Red Creek. Rebecca was in town purchasing supplies when she heard the commotion outside the general store. Stepping onto the boardwalk, she froze at the sight of her former fiancé dismounting from an unfamiliar stallion, his once fine clothes now dusty and worn. "Rebecca," he called, spotting her immediately. His handsome face broke into the charming smile that had once made her heart race. Now it only made her stomach clench with distaste. "Just the woman I've been looking for." The street seemed to empty around them as townsfolk suddenly found urgent business elsewhere, leaving them in an island of uncomfortable privacy. Rebecca straightened her spine, grateful she was wearing her best dress rather than her usual work clothes. "Mr. Harrison," she acknowledged coolly. "I'm surprised to see you back in Red Creek." Samuel approached, his confidence apparently undiminished by his previous behavior. "I've come to make things right," he declared, reaching for her hand. Rebecca stepped back, avoiding his touch. "There's nothing to make right. What's done is done." For the first time, Samuel seemed to notice the gold band on her finger, not the elaborate engagement ring he had given her and then taken back before fleeing, but Colton's mother's simple wedding band. "So the rumors are true," he said, his smile faltering. You actually married that cowhand." "I married a good man," Rebecca corrected, anger flaring. "Something you proved yourself not to be." Samuel's expression hardened. "Don't be foolish, Rebecca. We both know that marriage was a desperate solution to an unfortunate situation. I made a mistake leaving you at the altar, I admit that. But now I've returned to do the honorable thing." Rebecca laughed, the sound sharp with disbelief. "The honorable thing would have been not to abandon me in the first place, or perhaps not to court me solely for my father's land." Samuel had the grace to look abashed, though Rebecca doubted the sincerity. "That's not fair. I cared for you truly. I just panicked." "Well, your panic was the greatest favor you ever did me," Rebecca replied, gathering her parcels and preparing to leave. "Now, if you'll excuse me, my husband will be wondering where I am." Samuel caught her arm, his grip firmer than necessary. "Don't be hasty, Rebecca. I have connections in Denver now, important friends. I could give you the life you always wanted: travel, culture, fine things. Does your cowboy take you to the theater? Can he buy you silk dresses or proper jewelry?" Rebecca jerked her arm free, fury replacing her initial shock. "Colton gives me respect and honesty, two things you know nothing about. Now let me pass. Is there a problem here?" The deep voice came from behind her, and Rebecca turned to see Colton standing a few feet away, his stance casual but his eyes hard as flint as they assessed Samuel. He must have ridden into town to escort her home, a courtesy he often extended, though she was perfectly capable of making the journey alone. Samuel straightened, trying to match Colton's height and failing by several inches. "Just having a conversation with my fiancé," he said with deliberate provocation. "Wife," Colton corrected mildly, moving to stand beside Rebecca. His hand came to rest at the small of her back, a gentle touch that steadied her racing heart. "My wife." The possessive pronoun sent an unexpected thrill through Rebecca. She leaned slightly into Colton's solid presence, a silent declaration of her choice. Samuel's eyes narrowed as he observed the gesture. "A temporary arrangement, from what I hear, one that can be easily rectified." "You hear wrong," Rebecca interjected before Colton could respond. "My marriage is neither temporary nor in need of rectification." Samuel looked between them, his confidence visibly wavering. "You can't be serious, Rebecca. This man is a nobody, a drifter who happened to be in the right place at the right time." "That nobody is 10 times the man you'll ever be," Rebecca replied, her voice steady despite her anger. "He didn't leave me standing alone on what should have been the happiest day of my life." A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the tension radiating from the confrontation. Samuel glanced around, clearly uncomfortable with the public nature of his humiliation. "You'll regret this," he said, lowering his voice. "When you're still mucking stalls and mending fences 10 years from now while other women are attending society balls in Denver, you'll remember this moment and wish you'd made a different choice." Colton, who had remained remarkably composed throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "I think you've said enough, Harrison. My wife has made her position clear. I suggest you find somewhere else to be." Something in his quiet tone must have registered as dangerous because Samuel took a step back. "This isn't over," he muttered, but the threat sounded hollow even to Rebecca's ears. "Yes, it is," she replied firmly. "Goodbye, Samuel." Taking Colton's arm, she turned her back on her former fiancé and walked toward where their horses were hitched, holding herself together through sheer willpower. Only when they had ridden beyond the town limits did she allow her composure to crack, pulling her horse to a stop and pressing a trembling hand to her mouth. Colton immediately dismounted and came to help her down, his strong hands steadying her. "Are you all right?" he asked, genuine concern in his eyes. "I'm fine," she insisted, though tears threatened. "Just angry that he had the audacity to come back, to think I would simply fall into his arms after what he did." "Did you want to?" Colton asked quietly, his expression carefully neutral. "Fall into his arms, I mean." Rebecca stared at him in astonishment. "How can you ask me that, after everything?" Colton looked away, his jaw tight. "He's not wrong about some things. I can't give you theaters or silk dresses. I can't offer you the life he might have." "The life he pretended he would give me," Rebecca corrected, stepping closer. "Samuel's promises were as substantial as smoke, but you—" She reached up, placing her hand against his cheek, forcing him to look at her. You've never promised me anything you couldn't deliver." Colton covered her hand with his own, his eyes searching hers. "I want to promise you everything, Rebecca. Everything I have, everything I am." The raw honesty in his voice made her breath catch. This was not the practiced charm Samuel had wielded like a weapon, but something far more precious, the unvarnished truth of a man who had never learned to dissemble. "That's all I want," she whispered, and when he bent to kiss her, right there on the open road with the late summer sun warm on their shoulders, Rebecca knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice, or rather, that fate had made it for her when Samuel left her at the altar and Colton stepped forward to take his place. The return to the ranch was delayed as they sought privacy in a secluded meadow, reaffirming their bond in the most elemental way. Afterward, lying in the tall grass with her head on Colton's chest, Rebecca felt a peace she had never known with Samuel. "I think I'm falling in love with you," she confessed, the words easier to say than she had imagined. Colton's arms tightened around her. "I fell the day you ordered me to repair the henhouse and didn't take any excuses," he replied, his voice rumbling beneath her ear. 4 years ago and counting." Rebecca propped herself up to look at him in surprise. "That long," his smile was soft, almost shy, "that long, though I never thought I'd have the chance to tell you." "Tell me every day," she requested, pressing her lips to the hollow of his throat. "I think I need to hear it." "I love you, Rebecca Irvine," he obliged, his hand tangling in her hair as he drew her up for another kiss. "Today and every day that follows." As autumn painted the Colorado landscape in gold and crimson, Rebecca found herself facing an unexpected challenge, morning sickness that left her weak and nauseated as she tried to complete her daily chores. At first, she attributed it to a passing illness, but when Mrs. Perkins visited and observed her symptoms with a knowing smile, the truth became impossible to ignore. "You're carrying child," the older woman announced bluntly as Rebecca emerged pale-faced from another bout of sickness. "I'd say about 2 months along by the look of you." Rebecca sat heavily on a kitchen chair, her mind racing. A baby. She and Colton would have a child come spring, a child conceived in love, though their marriage had begun as convenience. The thought filled her with both terror and joy. "Does Colton know, Mrs. Perkins asked, setting a cup of peppermint tea before her. Rebecca shook her head. "I wasn't certain myself until now. Men can be blind to such things," the cook said with a chuckle. "Though he's been hovering around you like a mother hen these past weeks, so he suspects something's amiss." Indeed, Colton had been increasingly protective, insisting she rest more and taking on additional chores without being asked. Just that morning, he had pressed a hand to her forehead, frowning at her pallor before reluctantly leaving to help with a difficult calving at the main ranch. "I should tell him tonight," Rebecca decided, warming her hands on the teacup. "He'll be pleased, don't you think?" Mrs. Perkins smiled broadly. "That man looks at you like you hung the moon and stars, child. A baby will only make him happier." When Colton returned that evening, tired but satisfied after successfully delivering twin calves, Rebecca had prepared a special dinner. The table was set with the good china Mrs. Morton had left behind, and candles flickered in the growing darkness. "What's the occasion?" Colton asked, raising an eyebrow as he washed up at the basin. Rebecca smoothed her best dress nervously. "Can't a wife prepare a nice meal for her husband without an occasion?" Colton dried his hands, studying her with the careful attention he always paid when he sensed she was keeping something from him. "She can," he allowed, "but you've been sick all week and suddenly you're cooking beef roast and apple pie. Something's changed." Rebecca took a deep breath. "You should sit down." Alarm flashed across Colton's face. "Are you leaving?" he asked bluntly, remaining standing. "Is this about Samuel coming back? Because if he's threatened you or Colton—" Rebecca interrupted his spiraling concerns. "I'm not going anywhere." "This has nothing to do with Samuel." She took his hand, pulling him toward the table. "Please sit." He complied reluctantly, tension evident in every line of his body. Rebecca remained standing, suddenly uncertain how to share news she had only just accepted herself. "I've been sick," she began, nervously twisting her wedding band. "But it's not an illness exactly, it's—" She faltered, searching for the right words. Understanding dawned slowly on Colton's face, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. "Rebecca," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "are you saying what I think you're saying?" She nodded, tears springing to her eyes. "We're going to have a baby, in the spring." Colton sat motionless for a long moment, absorbing her words. Then, with a suddenness that startled her, he stood and swept her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in a joyous embrace. "A baby," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion as he set her gently back on her feet. "Our baby." His wonder matched her own, and Rebecca felt the last of her anxiety melt away. "Are you happy?" she asked, needing to hear the words. Colton laughed, the sound freer and lighter than she had ever heard from him. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," he declared, placing a hand reverently against her still flat stomach. "I never thought I'd have a family of my own, never thought I'd find someone to love, let alone create a child with." The dinner grew cold as they talked late into the night, making plans for the future. Their small cabin would need expansion beyond the recently added bedroom, a nursery for the baby, perhaps a larger kitchen. Colton spoke of building furniture himself, crib and cradle and tiny chairs for when the child grew older. "We should tell my father tomorrow," Rebecca said as they finally sat down to eat the reheated meal. "He'll be over the moon at the prospect of a grandchild." Colton nodded, though a shadow crossed his face. "Do you think he'll be disappointed it's my child and not Samuel's? Your father had such plans for the ranch with Samuel's connections." Rebecca reached across the table to take his hand. "My father has come to respect you more in these past months than he ever did Samuel in 2 years of courtship. He sees how you care for the land, how you care for me." She squeezed his fingers. "Besides, he told me last week that the best decision I ever made was letting you finish those vows." The shadow lifted from Colton's expression, replaced by a quiet pride. "I'll make you both proud," he promised. "You, your father, and our child." "You already have," Rebecca assured him, certain in that moment that the humiliation of being left at the altar had been not an ending but a beginning, the first step on a path that had led her to true happiness. The following morning, they rode to the main house together to share their news. Thomas Elliot, still moving slowly with his cane but looking healthier than he had in months, listened with growing delight as Rebecca announced her pregnancy. "A grandchild," he repeated, tears welling in his weathered eyes. "Your mother would have been so pleased, Rebecca." He turned to Colton, extending his hand. "You're a good man, son. I couldn't ask for a better father for my grandchild." The use of the word son was not lost on either of them. Colton shook Thomas's hand firmly, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "Thank you, sir. I promise to take care of them both." "I know you will," Thomas replied. Then, to their surprise, he reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a leather portfolio. "I've been meaning to speak with you both about the future of the ranch." Rebecca and Colton exchanged a curious glance as Thomas spread several documents across his desk. Land deeds, bank statements, and legal papers covered the polished surface. "I'm getting old," Thomas began, waving off Rebecca's automatic protest. "No, it's true, and denying it won't change facts. This ranch needs younger hands to guide it, especially now with a new generation on the way." He pushed the papers toward them. "I'm signing over the northern section to you both, including the water rights and timber land. It'll be legally yours, not just land you're working." Rebecca stared at her father in astonishment. "But the ranch has always been one piece. You've always said dividing it would weaken it." Thomas nodded, leaning on his cane. "That was before I saw how you two work together. You've made that scrubby northern section bloom in ways I never managed. And the truth is, I've been approached about selling the southern pastures." "Selling?" Colton asked, concern evident in his voice. "To whom? Railroads coming through," Thomas explained. "They want the flatland near town for a depot and stockyards. They're offering a fair price enough that I could retire comfortably and still leave you both a tidy sum in addition to the northern lands." Rebecca felt momentarily dizzy at the prospect of such change. The Elliot Ranch had been her family's home for 3 generations. The idea of part of it belonging to the railroad seemed almost sacrilegious. Sensing her distress, Colton placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "It's a lot to consider," he said diplomatically, Perhaps we should take some time to think it through. Thomas smiled approvingly. That's exactly what I hoped you'd say. A cautious approach speaks well for the future. He gathered the papers back into the portfolio and handed it to Colton. Take these home, study them. The railroad men won't be back until spring, so there's time to decide. As they rode home, Rebecca was quieter than usual, her mind filled with thoughts of change and continuity. The child growing within her represented the future. Her father's proposed sale of ranch land signified the end of an era. The emotions were complex and contradictory, much like her journey from abandoned bride to contented wife. "What are you thinking?" Colton asked as they approached their cabin, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the land they now knew would truly be theirs. Rebecca considered the question carefully. "I'm thinking that 6 months ago I thought I knew exactly what my future held. Now nothing is as I expected, and yet," she smiled, meeting his concerned gaze. "And yet, it's better than anything I could have planned." Colton's expression softened. "No regrets, then, about how things turned out, only that I didn't see what was right in front of me sooner," Rebecca replied honestly. "We could have had more time together." "We have all the time in the world now," Colton reminded her, his hand reaching for hers. "You, me, and the little one." As winter descended on Colorado, bringing snow that transformed the landscape into a glistening wonderland, Rebecca's body changed too, her slender frame softening as the child within her grew. Colton watched these changes with obvious fascination, his hands gentle when they traced the growing curve of her belly. The cabin expanded along with their family, Colton working tirelessly to complete the nursery before the worst of the winter storms. Neighbors came to help raise the new walls, a barn raising of sorts that filled the crisp November air with the sounds of hammering and good-natured banter. By Christmas, the expanded cabin was snug against the cold, the new rooms connecting seamlessly with the old. Rebecca's father joined them for Christmas dinner, his first visit to their home since the fire months earlier. He marveled at the improvements, particularly the nursery with its carefully crafted crib and rocking chair. "You've built something special here," he told them, not referring only to the physical structure. "Something that will last." Rebecca, watching her husband and father deep in conversation about spring planting, felt a contentment that transcended the physical discomfort of her advancing pregnancy. This was her family, expanded in ways she couldn't have imagined a year ago, stronger for the unexpected turns their lives had taken. January brought bitter cold and news that Samuel Harrison had married his Denver banker's daughter, only to be arrested for outstanding gambling debts the day after the wedding. The scandal was the talk of Red Creek for weeks, with many townsfolk stopping by to share the gossip with Rebecca, clearly expecting some satisfaction on her part. "I just feel sorry for his wife," she told Colton after Martha had departed, having shared the latest details with obvious relish. "She's discovering what kind of man he is far too late." Colton, working on a carved wooden horse for the baby, glanced up with a thoughtful expression. "You're a good woman, Rebecca Irvine. Most would be celebrating his downfall." Rebecca rested a hand on her prominent belly, feeling the baby's movements beneath her palm. "I have too much to be grateful for to waste energy on bitterness," she replied simply. "Samuel's choices led him to ruin, but they also led me to you. I can't regret the path that brought us here." February arrived with a thaw that turned the world to mud and brought with it a letter that changed everything once again. It came by special courier from Denver, addressed to Thomas Elliot but concerning land that now belonged legally to Rebecca and Colton. "It's from the territorial governor," Thomas explained when he arrived at their cabin, waving the official document. "The railroad has changed their plans. They want the northern section now, your section, not the southern pastures." Rebecca felt the blood drain from her face. "But we've built our home here. We're having a baby in weeks. They can offer 3 times what the southern land was worth," Thomas finished grimly. "Seems there's coal in those hills behind your property, very valuable to a railroad." Colton's expression had gone carefully blank, the mask he wore when processing difficult news. "What do you think we should do?" he asked Thomas, his voice neutral. The older man sighed heavily. It's not my decision to make. The land is yours now, legally and morally. I just thought you should know the offer on the table. After Thomas departed, promising to delay any response to the railroad until they'd had time to consider, Rebecca and Colton sat in silence at their kitchen table, the letter between them like a living thing. We could be wealthy, Colton finally said, stating the obvious. Wealthy enough to buy twice this much land elsewhere, build any kind of home you wanted. Rebecca looked around at the cabin they had transformed with their own hands, each corner holding memories of their journey from strangers to lovers to expectant parents. Is that what you want, to leave? Colton met her gaze steadily. What I want is for you and our child to be secure. If selling means ensuring that security, then yes, I could leave. He reached across the table to take her hand. Home is wherever you are, Rebecca. The land is just land. Rebecca squeezed his fingers, throat tight with emotion, but this is our land. The land where you found me by the creek that day, where you built our bedroom with your own hands, where our baby will take its first steps. She shook her head firmly. Money can't replace those things. No, Colton agreed softly, it can't. The decision, when they reached it, felt right to them both. They would keep the northern section, regardless of its newly discovered value. This was their home, the foundation of the legacy they would leave their children. No amount of money could replace the life they had built together. When Thomas returned the following day to hear their decision, he smiled with obvious pride. I hoped you'd say that, he admitted. The Elliot land, the Irvine land now, wasn't meant to be carved up for railroads and coal mines. The southern section. Rebecca asked, concerned for her childhood home. Thomas waved a dismissive hand. I've already written to decline their offer for that as well. Seems your example reminded an old man what truly matters. He patted his knee, inviting Rebecca to sit beside him as she had as a child. I was too quick to consider selling after your mother passed. The grief made me want change, any change, but this land is our blood and bone, Rebecca. It should stay in the family. March arrived with the first signs of spring crocuses pushing through the melting snow, birds returning from their winter migrations, and Rebecca's increasingly urgent preparations for the baby's arrival. The nursery was ready, tiny clothes folded in the dresser Colton had built, the cradle waiting beside their bed for the early weeks. The birth, when it came, was both more terrible and more miraculous than Rebecca had imagined. 18 hours of labor left her exhausted and triumphant, Colton never leaving her side despite the midwife's attempts to banish him to the traditional male waiting space. When their daughter finally arrived with a lusty cry just as dawn broke on March 15th, Colton wept unashamedly, overwhelmed by the perfect tiny being they had created together. Eleanor Margaret Irvine, Rebecca whispered, cradling the infant against her chest. They had chosen the name months ago, Eleanor for Colton's mother, Margaret for Rebecca's. She's perfect, Colton said, his voice thick with emotion as he gently stroked the baby's dark hair that already promised to be as black as his own. Perfect, just like her mother. Rebecca looked up at the man who had stepped forward on the worst day of her life and turned it into the beginning of her greatest joy. I love you, Colton Irvine, she said, the words feeling insufficient for the depth of emotion behind them, more than I ever thought possible. Colton bent to kiss her, then their daughter, completing the circle of their family. And I love you, Rebecca Irvine, from the moment you said yes at that altar, through every moment since and for all the moments to come. As the spring sunshine filtered through the curtains of their bedroom, bathing the scene in golden light, Rebecca thought about the strange twists of fate that had brought them to this point. Samuel's abandonment had seemed like an ending, but it had merely cleared the way for a beginning, a true love story that would continue to unfold in ways she could not yet imagine. 5 years later, Rebecca stood on the porch of the 2-story home that had replaced their original cabin, watching Colton teach their daughter to ride her first pony. Eleanor, with her father's dark hair and her mother's determined spirit, sat proudly in the small saddle, following Colton's instructions with serious attention. Beside Rebecca, 2-year-old Thomas napped in his cradle, exhausted from a morning spent helping his father in the barn. His arrival had completed their family circle, bringing joy to his namesake grandfather and reaffirming the bond between Rebecca and Colton. The ranch had prospered under their joint stewardship. The northern section now boasted the finest cattle herd in the county, and Colton's innovative breeding program had earned recognition throughout the territory. Rebecca's garden had expanded into a productive truck farm, supplying vegetables to Red Creek and neighboring communities. Thomas Elliot still lived in the main ranch house, though he spent much of his time with his grandchildren, spoiling them shamelessly and telling them stories of the early days on the frontier. The railroad had eventually come to Red Creek, but on the town's terms rather than the railroad's, bringing new opportunities without destroying the character of the community. As for Samuel Harrison, he had served a brief prison term for his debts before heading west to California. Occasionally, news of his latest schemes reached Red Creek, each more desperate than the last. Rebecca felt only a distant pity for the man who had once seemed to hold her future in his hands. "Mama, look," Eleanor called, urging her pony into a careful trot with Colton walking alongside. "I'm riding all by myself. I see you, sweetheart," Rebecca called back, pride swelling in her chest. "You're doing beautifully." Colton looked up, meeting Rebecca's gaze across the yard, his smile as warm and steady as his love had proven to be. In that moment, as on countless others over the years, Rebecca felt profound gratitude for the twist of fate that had left her standing alone at the altar that June day. For in being abandoned, she had found herself. And in Colton's simple offer, "Then I'll finish the vows myself," she had found not just a husband, but a partner, a lover, a father for her children, and a man whose quiet strength had become the foundation of her happiness. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the Colorado sky in brilliant orange and pink, Eleanor and Thomas both asleep inside, Colton took Rebecca's hand in his. "Any regrets?" he asked, an echo of the question he had posed in the early days of their marriage. Rebecca leaned her head against his shoulder, content in the life they had built together. "Only that we wasted so much time not knowing what was right in front of us. We found our way eventually," Colton reminded her, pressing a kiss to her temple, "and we have a lifetime still ahead." As darkness settled over the land that had shaped their story, Rebecca Irvine closed her eyes and offered a silent prayer of thanks for abandoned vows that had led to true ones. For a cowboy brave enough to step forward when everyone else stepped back, and for the love that had transformed what should have been her greatest humiliation into her most profound blessing. "A lifetime," she agreed, turning her face up to his for a kiss that held the promise of all the years to come. "And every day a gift."